Welcome to my channel. Tonight, I want to share a story that began not with an answer, but with a question. A question written by a 9-year-old girl in a hospital room with an east-facing window and an ancient oak tree standing guard outside. Her body was growing quieter each day, but her curiosity grew deeper. And instead of asking why this was happening to her, she began asking questions that opened doors in the hearts of everyone around her. This is not a story about dying. It is a story about attention, the quiet, radical act of noticing beauty when the world has narrowed to 4 walls. It is about how a single notebook, left open on a bedside table, became a library not of answers, but of presence. How questions like "What did you notice today that you've never noticed before?" and "What will you carry forward?" not as memory, but as practice, began to change not just a hospital room, but an entire wing of a building where children go to face the hardest truths life offers. Find a quiet moment. Let your breath slow. And allow these words to meet you exactly where you are, whether you carry grief, or wonder, or simply the quiet hope that even in small spaces, light finds a way. The hospital wing where room 12 waited was not like the rest of the building. While other corridors echoed with hurried footsteps and the metallic whisper of 4 poles, this wing curved gently toward the east, catching morning light before anywhere else. Its windows were larger than regulation required, floor-to-ceiling panes that framed the old oak tree standing sentinel in the courtyard below. Someone had planted that tree a century ago, not for patients who would come decades later, but simply because the groundskeeper believed every building deserved one living witness to its passage through time. The oak had survived droughts, lightning strikes, 2 world wars, and the slow creep of asphalt toward its roots. Now it stood with branches outstretched like open hands, offering shade in summer, skeletal poetry in winter, and in spring, a canopy of green so vibrant it seemed to pulse with its own heartbeat. Room 12 belonged to Elara. She was 9 years old when she arrived, not carried on a stretcher with dramatic urgency, but walking slowly beside her mother, one hand gripping the rail along the wall, the other holding a small cloth bag containing 3 treasures. A smooth river stone grey as twilight, a sprig of dried lavender tied with thread, and a blank notebook with a cover the colour of mist at dawn. Her diagnosis had no simple name. It was a constellation of Latin terms strung together like distant stars that, when connected, spelled out a single truth. Her body was learning to let go before her spirit was ready to depart. But Elara did not think in diagnoses. She thought in questions. Before illness narrowed her world to these 4 walls, Elara had been a collector of curiosities. While other children gathered stickers or trading cards, she gathered questions, the kind that opened doors rather than closed them. At 5, she asked her father why shadows have no weight. At 7, she wondered whether trees dream when their leaves fall. At 8, watching rain trace paths down a window pane, she asked her mother, "If a single drop of water holds the whole sky inside it, does that mean every small thing contains something infinite?" Her parents, Lena, a painter who mixed colors by intuition rather than formula, and Thomas, a music teacher who believed silence between notes mattered more than the notes themselves, never dismissed her inquiries with easy answers. Instead, they would sit with her in the quiet that followed each question, letting it breathe, letting it grow roots in the soil of their shared attention. "That's a beautiful question," Lena would say, her brush hovering above canvas. "Let's live inside it for a while." And they would. This habit of dwelling in questions rather than rushing toward answers became Elara's compass when the world began to shrink. The first months after diagnosis were a slow subtraction. School friends visiting less frequently until their absence felt like a new kind of weather soccer practice replaced by physical therapy sessions where each step forward felt like climbing a mountain. Birthday parties transforming into quiet afternoons with cake and 2 candles instead of 9. But through all this subtraction, one thing multiplied: her curiosity. Confined to bed or wheelchair, her attention turned inward and upward, not toward the ceiling, but toward the architecture of human experience. She noticed how Nurse Anya's hands trembled slightly when delivering bad news but steadied when adjusting a pillow beneath a child's head. She observed how Dr. Evans always paused at the door before entering room 12, as if shedding the weight of other patients' sorrows before crossing her threshold. She saw how the evening janitor, a woman named Rosa with silver streaks in her dark hair and a wedding band worn thin by decades of wear, would hum old folk songs while mopping the hallway, a sound so gentle it seemed to polish not just linoleum but the air itself. It was Rosa who gave Elara the notebook that would become the library. One Tuesday in late October, as golden hour light poured through the east-facing window and set the dust motes dancing like tiny spirits, Rosa entered room 12 not to clean. She never cleaned during visiting hours, but to return a book Elara had left on the hallway bench. A worn copy of The Little Prince. She placed it on the bedside table with care that belied her calloused hands, then hesitated. "You ask good questions," Rosa said softly, her accent carrying the music of a country Elara had never visited but could imagine through the cadence of her voice. "I hear you talking with your mamma. Not why me questions. Better ones." Elara looked up from the oak tree outside her window, where a single leaf was performing its final spiral descent to earth. "What kind of questions do you ask?" she wondered aloud. Rosa smiled, a slow unfolding like a flower opening at dawn. "I ask what the floor remembers. These tiles have held thousands of footsteps, some running toward joy, some dragging with grief. I ask what the walls have absorbed. Every whispered prayer, every silent tear, they leave traces. Not ghosts, just echoes." She touched the wall beside the doorframe, her fingers tracing invisible patterns. "This place is full of questions waiting to be asked." Before leaving, Rosa reached into her apron pocket and withdrew a small notebook, plain, unlined, its cover a soft grey-blue like the space between night and morning. "For your questions," she said. "Not answers. Questions are heavier. They need their own home." That night, as the oak tree outside her window became a silhouette against the violet sky, Elara opened the notebook. The first page felt infinite in its emptiness, not intimidating, but inviting, like a field of fresh snow waiting for the first footprint. She did not write her name on the cover. She did not date the first entry. Instead, she wrote a single sentence that would become the foundation of everything that followed. What if the right question could hold someone the way an arm holds a child? She left the notebook on her bedside table, not hidden beneath the mattress or tucked inside a drawer, but placed deliberately where light from the window would touch it each morning, where anyone entering the room might see it and feel invited rather than intruded upon. She did not announce her project. She simply began. The next morning, she wrote her first question on the second page, not in pencil that could be erased, but in indelible ink the color of midnight, each letter formed with care that belied her weakening hands. "What did you notice today that you've never noticed before?" She underlined no words. She added no explanation. The question stood alone on the page like a single tree on a hill, visible from great distances, offering shade to whoever reached it. Nurse Anya was the first to respond. During her afternoon rounds, she paused at Elara's bedside to adjust the fore-drip. Her eyes fell on the open notebook. She read the question silently, her lips moving almost imperceptibly as she absorbed its weight. For a full minute she stood there, the medical chart forgotten in her hands. Then, without asking permission, she picked up the pen resting beside the notebook, a simple black rollerball Elara kept for writing letters home, and wrote beneath the question. The way the light catches the edge of a spoon when it's placed just so on the tray table. Like a tiny rainbow no one ever looks for. She signed her initials, AM, and continued her rounds. But something had shifted in her gait. Her steps were lighter, as if she carried not the weight of another difficult day, but the lightness of having truly seen something small and beautiful. Elara read the response that evening as sunset painted the oak tree in hues of fire and gold. She did not smile triumphantly. She did not feel validated. She simply felt the quiet satisfaction of a seed finding fertile soil. The question had done its work, not by demanding an answer, but by creating space for attention. And attention, she was learning, was the first form of love. The following day, she wrote a new question on the next page. Whose hand did you hold today without needing a reason? This time the responses came faster. Dr. Evans, stopping by for his evening check-in, read the question and stood silently for nearly 2 minutes, long enough for Elara to notice the way his shoulders softened, the way his clinical posture melted into something more human. He wrote, "My daughter's. She's 24 and lives across the country, but we video called tonight." I reached toward the screen when she laughed. It wasn't the same as real touch, but it was real enough. Beneath his signature, ME, he added a single word in smaller letters. "Thank you." The janitor Rosa responded that night after her shift ended. She did not write in the notebook immediately upon seeing the question. Instead, she finished mopping the hallway, emptied her bucket, hung her mop to dry. Only then did she return to room 12, now dark except for the soft glow of the nightlight casting Elara's sleeping face in gentle relief. Rosa sat in the chair beside the bed, picked up the pen, and wrote with a careful script that revealed years of practice, perhaps letters written home to family across an ocean, perhaps prayers copied by hand in childhood. I held my husband's hand this morning while we drank coffee. 63 years together, and still I noticed the map of veins on the back of his hand like a river delta. I held it not because he was hurting, but because the steam from our cups made the kitchen window fog, and for a moment the whole world disappeared except for us. She signed with a single initial, R. And before leaving, she adjusted the blanket over Elara's shoulders with a tenderness that required no words. By the end of the first week, the notebook contained 7 questions and 17 responses. Elara did not read them as a collection of answers. She read them as a tapestry being woven in real time, each thread a different color, a different texture, but all contributing to a single pattern she could not yet see in full. She noticed how the questions changed the atmosphere of the room. Visitors lingered longer. Conversations deepened beyond polite inquiries about pain levels or test results. Parents of other children on the wing began stopping by room 12 not out of obligation, but curiosity, drawn by the quiet energy emanating from that small space where something unusual was happening. Not healing in the medical sense, Elara's body continued its slow, inexorable journey toward stillness, but healing of a different kind. The mending of attention, the restoration of wonder, the reawakening of eyes that had grown dull from staring too long at suffering. Elara's mother Laner noticed the change first. As a painter, she understood negative space, the importance of what is left unsaid, unseen, unoccupied. She saw how her daughter's questions created negative space in people's hearts. Room for beauty to enter where before there had been only crowded grief. One evening she found herself standing at Elara's window long after her daughter had fallen asleep, watching the oak tree under moonlight. And she realized she was not thinking about loss. She was noticing how the bark caught the silver light in patterns resembling ancient script, how the branches swayed not randomly but in rhythm with a wind she could not feel but could imagine. She was living inside a question without even knowing she had entered it. The following morning she wrote in the notebook, not in response to any specific question, but as an offering of her own. What question has been living inside you quietly, waiting for the right moment to be born? Elara read her mother's words when she woke. She did not answer immediately. She let the question settle in her like a seed finding depth in soil. Hours later, as afternoon light slanted through the window and set the dust motes dancing once more, she turned to a fresh page and wrote her response, not as daughter to mother, but as one soul to another. How much light can a single human heart hold before it has to let some of it go? She did not know it then, but this question would become the quiet engine of everything that followed, not just in the notebook, but in the lives of everyone who encountered it. For a library was beginning to form in room 12, not of books, but of questions that held more truth than any answer ever could. And libraries, once established, have a way of outliving their founders. The notebook grew slowly, like a tree adding rings beneath its bark, each page a season, each question a layer of wisdom accumulated not through years but through depth of attention. By December, it contained 47 questions and over 200 responses. The pages had begun to warp slightly from the weight of ink, from the moisture of hands that held the pen with tears glistening in their eyes, from the warmth of palms resting on open pages while their owners searched for words worthy of what they felt. Elara no longer wrote a new question each day. Some days she was too weak to lift the pen. Some days pain carved canyons through her concentration, leaving no room for the delicate work of question crafting. But on those days, something remarkable happened. Others began writing questions of their own. It started with Matteo, a boy of 11 in room 14 who had been receiving chemotherapy for 3 years. He was all sharp angles and defiant eyes, a child who had learned to armor himself against hope because hope had betrayed him too many times. He rarely spoke to staff beyond monosyllabic replies. He refused art therapy, music sessions, even the hospital dog visits that brought joy to other children. But one afternoon in early December, drawn by a curiosity he could not name, he wheeled himself into room 12 while Elara napped. He did not speak to her sleeping form. He simply sat in the chair Roser had occupied weeks earlier, opened the notebook to a fresh page, and wrote, "What sound makes you feel safe even when you're afraid?" He did not sign his name. He did not wait for a response. He closed the notebook gently, as if tucking a child into bed, and wheeled himself back to his room. But the next morning, when Nurse Anya made her rounds, she paused at Matteo's bedside longer than usual. She did not ask about his pain level or appetite. She simply said, "I heard rain on the roof last night." It sounded like fingers tapping a lullaby on glass. "That's my answer to your question." Matteo looked at her, really looked, for the first time in months. And he nodded once, a small gesture that contained more communication than 1,000 words. From that moment, the notebook ceased to belong solely to Elara. It became a communal space, a sanctuary where the currency was not achievement or endurance, but vulnerability offered freely and received without judgment. Parents wrote questions born of their terror and tenderness. What part of my child will I carry inside me after they're gone? A young resident physician, overwhelmed by the weight of decisions that determined life and death, wrote, "How do I hold hope in one hand and realism in the other without dropping either?" Even the hospital chaplain, a man in his 70s who had counseled thousands through grief, found himself writing one evening after everyone had gone home. When did I stop asking questions and start offering only answers? Elara read every response. Not as validation of her project, but as sacred text, each entry a window into a soul's private landscape. She noticed patterns emerging not in the content of answers, but in their transformation over time. Nurse Anya's early responses had been practical, clinical. I noticed the patient in 8B finally ate a full meal. But by January, her entries had deepened. I noticed how the sunrise painted the wall behind the nurse's station in colors no paint could replicate, and for 3 minutes, I forgot I was at work and remembered I was alive. Dr. Evans, once all data and attachment, began writing about his daughter's wedding plans, about the novel he'd started reading for pleasure after 20 years of medical journals, about the way his dog still greeted him with the same joy regardless of how many difficult days he carried home from a hospital. The questions were not magic spells that erased suffering. Pain still visited room 12 in waves that left Elara breathless and pale. Fear still coiled in her parents' hearts each time a new test result arrived. Death still waited beyond the horizon like a destination on a map she could not avoid. But something had shifted in the quality of their journey toward that destination. The path had not shortened, but it had widened, enough to walk side by side rather than in single file. Enough to notice wildflowers growing in the cracks between stones. Enough to pause and drink from streams they would have rushed past before. Elara's father Thomas brought his guitar to the hospital one evening in January. He did not play for an audience. He simply sat by the window as dusk settled over the oak tree and strummed chords that had no name, melodies born in the moment, shaped by the quality of light fading from gold to indigo to deep violet. Elara listened with her eyes closed, her breathing syncing with the rhythm of his playing. When he finished, she turned to a fresh page in the notebook and wrote a question that had been forming in her for weeks. What song lives inside you that you've never sung aloud? Thomas read the question later that night. He did not write his answer immediately. He waited until the following morning, when Elara was awake and the sun had just cleared the horizon, painting the room in that particular shade of gold she loved most. Then he picked up the pen and wrote not words, but musical notation, a single line of melody with no lyrics, no title, just 5 notes that rose and fell like a breath held and released. Beneath the staff he wrote one sentence. This is the song my heart makes when I watch you sleep. Weeks later, after Elara was gone, Lena would find herself humming those 5 notes while mixing paint in her studio. She did not know their origin at first, only that they carried a quality of peace she had not felt since her daughter's last breath. When she finally recognized them as the melody Thomas had transcribed in a notebook, she understood. Some questions do not seek answers. They seek vessels. And once poured into a vessel, they continue to hold their contents long after the hands that poured them have stilled. The notebook's influence began spilling beyond room 12. Nurse Anya started keeping a small journal in her locker where she wrote one question each morning before her shift began, not for anyone else to read, but to set the tone for her day. What small kindness can I offer without being asked? Whose pain might be hidden behind a smile today? Dr. Evans began opening staff meetings not with statistics or protocols, but with a single question from Elara's notebook projected on the screen behind him. The first time he did this, displaying what did you notice today that you've never noticed before, the room fell into a silence so profound it felt like a physical presence. For 30 seconds, 20 medical professionals sat in collective stillness. Then one nurse spoke about the way a child's eyelashes cast shadows on their cheeks when they slept. Another mentioned the particular shade of blue in a patient's eyes that reminded her of her grandmother's china. By the time the meeting adjourned, something had shifted in the room's atmosphere, not dramatically, but perceptibly, like air after rain. The hospital administration took notice. Not in the way institutions usually notice things, with forms and committees and strategic initiatives, but quietly, through the changed demeanor of staff who worked the East Wing. Complaints decreased. Staff retention improved. Families began specifically requesting rooms near 12, not because they believed in miracles, but because they sensed something different happening there, a quality of attention that made suffering more bearable not by diminishing it, but by surrounding it with beauty. In February, the hospital's director of pastoral care, a woman named Miriam who had spent 30 years listening to the unspoken questions of the dying, approached Lena and Thomas with a request. She did not ask for the notebook. She did not propose turning it into a program or curriculum. She simply asked, When the time comes, would you consider allowing us to make a single copy? Not for display, not for publication, but for the next child who needs what Elara created. Laner looked at Thomas. Thomas looked at Elara, who was watching a sparrow build its nest in the oak tree's branches. And Elara, without turning from the window, said softly, "The questions don't belong to me. They belong to whoever needs them." Miriam understood this was consent. She arranged for a professional archivist to photograph each page under museum-quality lighting. No flash, no handling beyond what was necessary. The process took an entire Saturday while Elara slept. When she woke to find the archivist carefully packing her equipment, she simply smiled and said, "Thank you for being gentle with them." The original notebook remained in room 12. But a perfect facsimile, printed on paper matching the original's weight and texture, bound in a cover dyed to the exact shade of mist at dawn, was placed in a climate-controlled drawer in Miriam's office. She did not know then that this single copy would become the first volume in a library that would eventually fill an entire bookshelf, then a room, then a dedicated space on the hospital's third floor with a skylight and a view of the oak tree. Elara's body continued its slow journey towards stillness. February gave way to March. The oak tree outside her window began to show the faintest green haze along its branches, a promise kept year after year regardless of who stood beneath it to witness. Elara's strength waned. Some days she could not lift her head from the pillow. Some days pain required medication that left her drifting between worlds. But on the days when clarity returned, she still reached for the notebook. Her handwriting grew smaller, more cramped, the letters leaning into one another as if seeking support. But the questions retained their precision, their grace. On the first day of spring, with the oak tree finally wearing its full cloak of green and sunlight streaming through the window in thick golden beams, Elara wrote what would become her final question. She did not know it would be her last. She wrote it with the same care she had given the first, the same belief that a well-formed question could hold someone the way an arm holds a child. She wrote, "What will you carry forward when I am gone, not as memory, but as practice?" She underlined no words. She added no explanation. She simply closed the notebook and placed it on her bedside table where the afternoon light would find it, where whoever entered the room next would feel invited to respond. Nurse Anya was the first to read it. She had just finished adjusting Elara's pillows, her hands moving with the gentle precision of someone who had learned that touch could be both clinical and sacred. She read the question once, then again. Then she sat in the chair beside the bed and wept, not the silent tears of professional composure breaking, but deep, shuddering sobs that came from a place deeper than grief. When she finally lifted her head, her eyes were red-rimmed but clear. She picked up the pen and wrote, "I will carry the practice of noticing. Not just symptoms and vital signs, but the way light falls on a face when hope returns. Not just what is broken, but what remains whole. I will carry this not as a technique, but as a way of being in the world. Thank you for teaching me that attention is the highest form of love." She signed her full name, Anya Marie Peterson, and added her nursing license number beneath it, as if making a vow witnessed by both heaven and earth. One by one, others responded. Dr. Evans wrote about carrying forward the practice of pausing before entering a patient's room, not to prepare medically, but to prepare humanly. Rosa wrote about carrying the practice of humming while she worked, not as distraction, but as offering. Thomas wrote about carrying the practice of listening to silence between notes. Lena wrote about carrying the practice of mixing colors not to match reality, but to reveal its hidden music. Elara read each response as it appeared. She did not comment. She did not thank anyone aloud. She simply absorbed their words like a plant absorbs light, quietly, completely, transforming them into something that sustained her even as her body failed. And when she could no longer hold the pen herself, she dictated one final entry to her mother, a single sentence that would become the last words in the original notebook. The questions were never mine to keep. They were always meant to be passed hand to hand like a candle flame, diminished not at all by the sharing, but multiplied into light enough for everyone. Elara left on an April morning when the world was soft with new green, and the oak tree outside her window wore blossoms the color of pale honey. There was no struggle at the end, no dramatic final breath that demanded witness. Instead, there was a gradual softening, like a wave returning to ocean, like a sigh finding its home after a long journey. Her parents sat on either side of the bed, their hands resting lightly on hers, one palm upturned to receive, one palm downturned to release. The notebook lay open on the bedside table to the final page, where her last words waited like seeds planted in fertile soil. Sunlight streamed through the window, catching dust motes that danced above her still form like ascending spirits. And in that moment, the room held not emptiness but fullness, a presence so palpable it seemed to thicken the air, to slow time itself. For 3 days after her departure, the notebook remained untouched on the bedside table. Nurses entered room 12 to clean and prepare it for the next occupant, but each one paused upon seeing the open book, each one sensing that some sacred process was still unfolding within its pages. On the 4th day, Miriam arrived with a small wooden box lined in velvet the color of twilight. She did not close the notebook. She did not remove it from the light. She simply placed the box beside it and sat in the chair Roser had favored, waiting. At noon, Nurse Anya entered with fresh linens. She saw Miriam and understood without words what was needed. She did not speak. She simply stood beside the bed, her hands folded over the fabric in her arms, and allowed herself to feel the full weight of the absence that now occupied the room. After several minutes, she reached out and gently turned the final page of the notebook, revealing a blank sheet that Elara had left intentionally empty. Anya understood this was not an omission but an invitation. She picked up the pen and wrote one sentence. The first practice I carry forward. To honor silence as a form of speech. She signed her name and left the room without looking back. But something had shifted in her, not a healing of grief, for grief does not heal that way, but a transformation of its quality. The sharp edges had begun to soften into something that could be carried without cutting the hands that held it. One by one, others came to room 12 that day. Not to mourn publicly, but to complete a quiet ritual each felt compelled to perform. Dr. Evans arrived during his lunch break and wrote. The practice of seeing not just the disease, but the person it visits. Roser came after her shift ended and wrote. The practice of finding music in ordinary sounds. Thomas sat for an hour in the afternoon light and wrote nothing, simply traced the shape of Elara's final sentence with his finger as if memorizing its contours for a lifetime. Laner arrived last, as dusk painted the oak tree in shades of rose and gold. She did not write a new practice. She simply added one word beneath her daughter's final sentence, a single word that completed the thought without altering its meaning. Always. Then she closed the notebook for the first time since Elara had opened it months earlier. The sound of the cover meeting the back was soft but definitive, a period at the end of a sentence, not an ending of the story itself. She placed the book in Miriam's velvet-lined box, closed the lid, and carried it from the room without looking back. But she did not take it home. She gave it to Miriam with 3 words. Begin the library. And so it began. Miriam did not create a memorial. She did not frame pages or mount the notebook behind glass. Instead, she ordered 50 blank notebooks identical to Elara's, the same grey-blue cover, the same unlined cream-colored pages, the same binding that opened flat without resistance. She placed one in room 12 the day its new occupant arrived, a girl of 7 named Chloe who had been diagnosed with the same constellation of Latin terms that had shaped Elara's final year. Miriam did not explain the notebook's origin. She simply placed it on the bedside table where morning light would touch it, and said to Chloe's mother, "Your daughter may find this useful. Or she may not. There is no expectation." Chloe did not open the notebook for 2 weeks. She was angry at her body for betraying her, angry at the world for continuing its indifferent rotation, angry at the cheerful posters on the hospital walls that seemed to mock her suffering. But one rainy afternoon in May, with thunder rumbling in the distance and the oak tree outside her window swaying in the wind, she picked up the notebook out of boredom rather than hope. She turned to the first page and read Elara's opening sentence. What if the right question could hold someone the way an arm holds a child? Something in her tightened chest loosened, not completely, but enough to allow a single breath deeper than the ones that had come before. She turned the page and read the first question. What did you notice today that you've never noticed before? She looked out the window at the rain tracing parts down the glass, parts that reminded her of the veins on a leaf she had pressed between book pages the summer before diagnosis. And she noticed something she had never noticed. Each raindrop followed its own unique path, yet all paths led downward toward the same earth. Individuality and unity coexisting in a single moment. She picked up the pen resting beside the notebook and wrote her first response, not beautifully, not poetically, but truthfully. The way raindrops race down glass but never collide. Like they know where they're going and respect each other's journey. She did not sign her name. She simply closed the notebook and placed it back on the table. But the next morning, she opened it again. And the morning after that. And within a week, she had written her first question on a fresh page. What color is kindness? The library had found its second voice. Over the following months, Miriam established a quiet protocol. Every 90 days, on the first day of each season, a new notebook would be placed in room 12. The previous notebook would be carefully archived in a fireproof cabinet in Miriam's office, its pages photographed and catalogued not as artifacts but as living documents. No names were recorded alongside entries, only room numbers and dates, preserving anonymity while honoring contribution. The hospital administration, initially skeptical of what they termed an unstructured emotional intervention, gradually became supporters as patient satisfaction scores rose and staff reported feeling more connected to their purpose. But Miriam refused all requests to formalize the practice, to create training modules or measure outcomes. Some things diminish when measured, she told the hospital CEO during their annual review. This is one of them. Trust the questions. They know what to do. By the end of that first year, 7 notebooks had been filled. Room 12 had housed 12 children, some who stayed weeks, some months, one who remained only 3 days before passing quietly in the night. Each child had interacted with the notebook differently. Some wrote daily. Some never wrote at all but were observed simply holding the book, turning pages slowly as if absorbing the questions through touch alone. One boy, non-verbal since birth, would point to questions that resonated with him, and his mother would write his responses based on the subtle shifts in his expression, a slight softening around the eyes for joy, a tightening of the jaw for pain, a slow blink for peace. The notebook accommodated all forms of expression without judgment. It asked only for presence. The practice began spilling beyond room 12 organically, like water finding its level. Parents waiting in the oncology wing's family lounge started bringing their own notebooks, plain composition books at first, then ones matching the grey-blue cover they had glimpsed through half-open doors. They wrote questions for each other. What gave you strength today? What small victory did we miss in our focus on the big battles? Staff members adopted the practice in subtle ways. The cafeteria worker who served meals on the East Wing began placing small cards beside each tray, not with nutritional information, but with a single question printed in elegant script. What are you grateful for in this moment? The hospital gift shop started selling blank notebooks with a small embossed symbol on the cover. An infinity sign intertwined with a question mark, a design Miriam had commissioned from a local artist after noticing how often Elara's questions circled back to themes of continuity and curiosity. But the most profound transformation occurred not in systems or spaces, but in individuals, quiet shifts that accumulated like sediment forming new land. Nurse Anya, now promoted to head nurse of the pediatric palliative wing, began each shift by writing one question in a small journal she kept in her pocket. She did not share these questions with anyone. They were her private practice, her way of carrying forward what Elara had taught her about attention as love. One evening, after a particularly difficult day when a child had passed despite every intervention, she found herself unable to leave the hospital. She sat in an empty family room, the journal open on her lap, and wrote a question that had been forming in her all day. How do I hold space for grief without letting it hollow me out? She did not expect an answer. But as she sat with the question in the quiet room, watching dusk settle over the parking lot outside, an understanding arose not as words but as sensation, a knowing in her bones that grief was not something to be held despite living, but something to be woven into living, like threads of indigo woven into gold cloth to create a richer whole. She closed the journal and went home that night not healed, but whole, carrying her sorrow not as a burden, but as a testament to love's depth. Dr. Evans retired 2 years after Elara's passing, not because he was old, but because he had reached a point where he could no longer practice medicine without integrating the wisdom he had gained from a 9-year-old girl's questions. He purchased a small cottage on the coast and began seeing patients not in an office, but on long walks along the shore. His treatments consisted largely of asking questions, Elara's questions, adapted to each person's circumstance. What did you notice today that you've never noticed before? Whose hand did you hold without needing a reason? He did not bill insurance for these sessions. He accepted payment in seashells, wildflowers, or simply the promise that his patients would ask one meaningful question of someone else before the week ended. Former colleagues called him eccentric. His patients called him the first doctor who had ever truly seen them. Roser continued mopping the halls of the East Wing for another 5 years before retiring at 78. On her final day of work, the entire staff gathered in the main lobby to honor her decades of service. They presented her with a bouquet of flowers, a gift card, a framed certificate. But the gift that made her weep was brought forward by Miriam, a simple grey-blue notebook, filled not with questions, but with responses to a single question Elara had written in the original volume. Who has made your journey lighter without knowing it? Every staff member who had worked the East Wing in the past 5 years had contributed an entry about Roser, describing how her humming had calmed anxious children, how her gentle hands had adjusted pillows with reverence, how her presence had transformed sterile corridors into spaces that felt, however briefly, like home. Roser did not read the entries aloud. She simply held the notebook to her chest and wept tears that carried the weight of a lifetime's quiet service finally witnessed. Thomas returned to teaching music, but his approach had fundamentally shifted. He no longer focused solely on technique or repertoire. He began each class by asking students to sit in silence for 3 minutes and simply listen, to the hum of the radiator, to the distant traffic, to their own breathing. Then he would ask, "What did you hear that you usually filter out?" His students, initially resistant to this unorthodox practice, gradually discovered that listening to silence made them better musicians, not because it improved their technical skill, but because it deepened their capacity to hear the emotional truth in every note. One of his students, a girl who had lost her mother to cancer the year before, wrote in her end-of-semester reflection, "Mr. Thomas taught me that music isn't about filling silence. It's about honoring it." And that's what my mom would have wanted me to learn. Lena's painting changed after Elara's passing, not in subject matter, but in luminosity. Before, her work had been technically proficient but emotionally restrained, landscapes rendered with precision but lacking breadth. After, her canvases seemed to glow from within, as if she had learned to mix light itself into her pigments. She did not paint Elara's face or recreate scenes from the hospital. Instead, she painted the quality of attention Elara had embodied. The way morning light fell across a windowsill, the intricate architecture of a single leaf's veins, the subtle shift in shadow as afternoon deepened toward evening. Critics called her new work meditative. Collectors paid premium prices for pieces that seemed to hold space for contemplation. But Lena knew the truth. She was not creating art. She was practicing the questions her daughter had left behind. Each brushstroke was an answer to what did you notice today that you've never noticed before. Each canvas was an offering to the practice of seeing deeply. 5 years after Elara's departure, the hospital dedicated a small room on the 3rd floor to what had become known simply as the Question Library. It was not a museum. It contained no plaques explaining Elara's story, though staff knew it, and shared it quietly with families who asked. Instead, it was a living space, a circular room with comfortable chairs arranged around a central table where the current notebook rested beneath a skylight that channeled sunlight onto its open pages. The walls held shelves containing every notebook from room 12 since the first grey-blue volume, 73 books spanning 5 years, each filled with questions and responses in hundreds of different hands. Visitors were welcome to read any volume, to write in the current notebook, or simply to sit in silence surrounded by the accumulated wisdom of children who had faced mortality with curiosity rather than fear. The room's only decoration was a single piece of art above the door, a watercolor painted by Lena depicting the oak tree outside room 12 in all 4 seasons simultaneously. Bare branches against winter sky, pale green buds of spring, full summer canopy, golden leaves of autumn, all existing in the same frame, suggesting that endings and beginnings are not sequential but simultaneous, that loss and growth occupy the same space in the heart. Beneath the painting, carved into the wooden lintel, were Elara's final words. The questions were never mine to keep. They were always meant to be passed hand to hand like a candle flame, diminished not at all by the sharing, but multiplied into light enough for everyone. 10 years after Elara's passing, a boy named Leo arrived in room 12. He was 8 years old, with eyes the color of twilight sky and a quiet intensity that reminded the seasoned nurses of someone they could almost remember but not quite place. His diagnosis was different from Elara's, a different constellation of Latin terms spelling out a different timeline, but the underlying truth was the same. His body was learning to let go before his spirit was ready to depart. His parents, David and Claire, moved through the hospital corridors with the stunned gait of people who had just been told the earth was flat after a lifetime of believing it round. They spoke in hushed tones, jumped at the sound of paging systems, flinched when doctors approached with clipboards. They were drowning in a sea of information, treatment options, prognosis statistics, clinical trial eligibility, but starving for meaning. Leo noticed the notebook on his second day in room 12. It sat on the bedside table exactly where morning light would touch it first, its grey-blue cover worn soft at the edges from years of handling. He did not open it immediately. He simply observed it, the way its cover caught the light, the way its spine curved gently from being opened and closed countless times, the way it seemed to hold space in the room without demanding attention. On the 3rd day, during a rare pain-free hour when the sun streamed through the window and set dust motes dancing above his bed, he reached for it. His mother watched from the chair by the window, her hands clenched in her lap. She wanted to stop him, to protect him from whatever sadness might live in those pages, to shield him from reminders of mortality when he was already facing too much of it. But something in Leo's posture, the gentle reverence with which his small hands cradled the book, stopped her. She remained silent. Leo opened the notebook to the first page. He read Elara's opening sentence slowly, his lips moving almost imperceptibly as he absorbed its weight. What if the right question could hold someone the way an arm holds a child? He turned the page. Read the first question. Looked out the window at the oak tree, now massive with age, its branches stretching wider than the building itself, its roots deep enough to have witnessed a decade of children passing through room 12. He noticed something he had not noticed before. A single branch growing horizontally rather than upward, as if the tree had chosen a different path toward the sky, not because it could not grow vertically, but because it had discovered another way to reach the light. He picked up the pen resting beside the notebook, a simple black rollerball, identical to the one Elara had used a decade earlier, and wrote his first response. I noticed how one branch of the oak tree grows sideways instead of up. Like it found its own way to the sun. Maybe we all get to choose our direction, even when we can't choose our destination. He did not sign his name. He simply closed the notebook and placed it back on the table where the light would find it. But the next morning, he opened it again. And the morning after that. And within a week, he had written his first question on a fresh page, a question born not of despair, but of the quiet wisdom that sometimes blooms in confined spaces. What small thing have you loved today without needing a reason? The library had found its next voice. David noticed the change in his son first. Not a sudden transformation. Grief and illness do not work that way, but a subtle shift in quality. Leo still experienced pain. He still had days when getting out of bed felt impossible. He still faced the same prognosis that had shattered his parents' world. But something in his relationship to suffering had changed. He was no longer fighting against it with every fiber of his being, a battle that exhausted everyone involved. Instead, he was learning to sit beside it, to observe it with curiosity rather than terror, to find pockets of beauty within the landscape of limitation. One afternoon, David found him watching a spider spin its web in the corner of the room, his expression not of boredom or despair, but of genuine fascination. "She's not in a hurry," Leo said when David asked what held his attention. "She just keeps adding thread where it's needed. Doesn't matter if the wind blows part away. She just starts again. That's kind of brave." David sat beside him in silence for a long time, watching the spider work. And for the first time since diagnosis, he felt not the crushing weight of impending loss, but a flicker of something resembling peace, not because he had accepted his son's fate, but because he had witnessed his son finding meaning within it. That evening he wrote in the notebook for the first time. "I loved the way my son's eyes lit up watching a spider build its web. Not because it distracted him from pain, but because it reminded me that wonder survives even in the smallest spaces." Claire began writing in the notebook a week later, after a particularly difficult night when Leo's pain had been unmanageable and she had sat helplessly beside his bed, her hand resting on his forehead, her heart breaking with each labored breath. The next morning, exhausted and hollow, she opened the notebook seeking, she did not know what. Comfort? Distraction? A sign that others had survived this particular flavor of hell? What she found was a question written by a child named Maya 3 years earlier. "What did you hold on to when everything else slipped away?" And Claire wrote her truth, not beautifully, not poetically, but with the raw honesty that only exhaustion allows. "I held on to the memory of his larf. Not the weak cough larf of these hospital days, but the real one, the one that started in his belly and shook his whole body and made milk come out his nose at the dinner table last summer. I held on to her that sound like a lifeline. And for a few seconds, it was enough." She did not know that Nurse Anya would read those words during her rounds that afternoon. Did not know that Anya, now 58, her hair more silver than brown, her hands still steady after 20 years of holding space for dying children, would stand silently by the bedside table for 3 full minutes after reading Claire's entry, tears tracing paths through the faint lines around her eyes. Did not know that Anya would return to the nurse's station and pull a small journal from her locker, the same one she had kept since Elara's time, and write a single sentence. Today I remembered why I stay. Not to fix what's broken, but to witness the love that remains whole. The questions continued their quiet work. Leo wrote about the taste of orange slices his mother brought from the hospital cafeteria, how the burst of citrus felt like a tiny rebellion against the blandness of hospital food. He wrote about the way sunset painted the wall behind his bed in shades of rose and gold for exactly 7 minutes each evening, a daily gift he had learned to anticipate and savor. He wrote about the sound of his father's breathing as he slept in the chair beside the bed, a rhythm so steady it became a lullaby Leo carried into his own dreams. Other children on the wing began visiting room 12, not for playdates or medical reasons, but to sit with Leo and the notebook. They would gather on the floor around his bed, parsing the book between them like a sacred text, reading questions aloud in hushed voices, writing responses with the solemn concentration of acolytes performing a ritual. A girl named Sophia, who had lost her hair to chemotherapy and wore a bright yellow scarf knotted with defiant flair, wrote in response to Leo's question about small loves. I loved the way the sun felt on my scalp today. No hair to block it. Just pure warmth. Like the sky was kissing me directly. A boy named Matteo, the same name as the defiant boy from years earlier, though this was a different child entirely, wrote about loving the weight of his mother's hand on his shoulder as she read him stories, how that pressure contained entire worlds of safety he could not name but could feel in his bones. These children were not performing bravery for adults. They were not trying to comfort their parents or inspire staff. They were simply practicing the art of attention in the face of limitation, a practice Elara had seeded a decade earlier without knowing its harvest would feed so many. Leo's body continued its slow journey toward stillness. Summer gave way to autumn. The oak tree outside his window began its annual transformation, leaves shifting from green to gold to crimson before releasing their hold and spiraling earthward in a final dance. Leo watched this process with the same quiet attention he had given the spider's web, the sunset's colors, the taste of oranges. He did not see death in the falling leaves. He saw completion. Release. The courage to let go when holding on was no longer possible or necessary. One afternoon in late October, with the oak tree wearing its full autumn splendor and sunlight streaming through the window in thick golden beams, Leo wrote what would become his final question. He did not know it would be his last. He wrote it with the same care Elara had given her questions a decade earlier, the same belief that a well-formed question could hold someone the way an arm holds a child. He wrote, "What will you do with the love that has nowhere left to go?" He underlined no words. He added no explanation. He simply closed the notebook and placed it on his bedside table where the afternoon light would find it. His mother read the question that evening after he had fallen into a medicated sleep. She read it once. Then again. Then she sat in the chair by his bed and wept, not the silent tears of composure breaking, but deep, shuddering sobs that came from a place deeper than grief. When she finally lifted her head, her eyes were red-rimmed but clear. She picked up the pen and wrote, "I will let it flow outward, into kindness for strangers, patience for the impatient, generosity for those who have less than I. I will not hoard it as a relic of what was lost. I will spend it freely as an inheritance from what was loved. This is how love defeats death. Not by refusing to let go, but by refusing to stop giving." She signed her name, Claire Marie Henderson, and added the date beneath it, as if making a vow witnessed by both heaven and earth. Leo left on a November morning when the world was painted in fire, maples blazing crimson, oaks glowing bronze, the sky impossibly clear and blue. There was no struggle at the end. Just a slow softening, like a wave returning to ocean, like a sigh finding its home after a long journey. His parents sat on either side of the bed, their hands resting lightly on his, one palm upturned to receive, one palm downturned to release. The notebook lay open on the bedside table to his final question, where responses continued to appear for days after his departure, written by nurses, doctors, parents of other children, even the hospital CEO who had once been skeptical of unstructured emotional interventions. Miriam arrived on the third day with a new grey-blue notebook, the 127th volume in the library's history. She did not remove Leo's notebook immediately. She simply placed the new one beside it and sat in the chair Roser had favored a decade earlier, waiting. At noon, a girl named Meyer, now 15, healthy and strong after a remission that had seemed impossible years ago, entered room 12. She had been one of the children who gathered around Leo's bed to share the notebook. She had written responses to his questions with the fierce tenderness of someone who understood both sides of the threshold between life and death. Meyer did not weep when she saw the empty bed. She simply walked to the bedside table, read Leo's final question and the responses beneath it, and then opened the new notebook to its first page. She did not write Elara's opening sentence. What if the right question could hold someone the way an arm holds a child, though she knew it by heart? Instead, she wrote her own version, born of a decade spent in and out of this hospital, born of having witnessed both loss and survival. What if the right question could help us carry love forward when the one we love is gone? She underlined no words. She added no explanation. She simply closed the notebook and placed it where morning light would touch it first, where the next child to occupy room 12 would find it waiting, not as a monument to loss, but as an invitation to attention, to curiosity, to the quiet practice of noticing beauty even in the smallest spaces. The oak tree outside the window stood bare now, its branches etched against the winter sky like a map of all the parts love had taken through this place. But deep within its roots, sap was already beginning its slow journey upward, preparing for spring, for new leaves, for another season of witnessing. And in the room where children came to face the hardest truths life offers, a new notebook waited open on a bedside table, its first page blank and full of possibility, ready to receive the next question that would hold someone the way an arm holds a child. For libraries do not end with their founders. They grow in silence, shelf by shelf, volume by volume, question by question, each one a seed planted in fertile soil, each one waiting for the right moment to sprout, to reach for light, to become part of the forest that shelters those who come after. And in that truth lives not consolation for loss, but celebration of continuity, a continuity no boundary of breath or time can ever sever. The questions remain. The light remains. The practice continues. Always. And so the questions remain. Not as monuments to what was lost, but as invitations to what remains possible. The notebook in room 12 has been replaced many times over the years, 73 volumes and counting. Each one filled with different hands, different hearts, the same quiet practice. To notice. To hold space. To love without needing a reason. Elara never knew her questions would become a library. Leo never knew his final words would be read by strangers years later. But this is the quiet truth they both embodied. Love does not end when breath does. It changes form. It becomes the way a nurse pauses to watch light catch the edge of a spoon. It becomes the way a mother hums while washing dishes, remembering a child's laugh. It becomes the blank page waiting on a bedside table for the next voice to speak. If this story touched something in you tonight, if it reminded you to notice one small beauty before sleep, carry that noticing into tomorrow. Share this with someone who needs to remember. You are not alone in your questions. And the right question, offered gently, can hold another person the way an arm holds a child. If these words brought you peace, consider subscribe to my channel. Here we do not avoid life's hardest moments. We meet them softly and discover the light waiting within them. Before you go, close your eyes for just one breath. Ask yourself one small question. What did I love today without needing a reason? And carry that answer with you into the night. You are seen. You are held. And your questions, however quiet, matter more than you know. Until we meet again in the quiet. Walk gently,